Supah Ritz, Volume 2, Chapter 8, War Stories. After about a year as a junior executive at Phoenix Pictures, I finally started to make some real connections in the biz. It wasn't that difficult, to be honest. I worked for a high-profile financier with full greenlight capacity. People wanted to get to know me. If anything, the biggest challenge I faced in establishing new relationships was my own insecurity. Hollywood just never felt like a place where I belonged. I didn't know anything about movies or pop culture, so a lot of the conversations in Hollywood were as strange to me as my own teenagers' talk of Kai Cenat or Charlie D'Amelio. I was also generally weirded out by the naked ambition of my peers. Their eagerness to form relationships felt shamelessly transactional. It seemed they were willing to befriend anyone who might advance their careers. I, on the other hand, grew up in a preppy enclave on the East Coast, where you only made friends with people whose great-grandparents had gone to the same kindergarten as your own great-grandparents. I wish I'd been more open. I wish I'd been more trusting. I wish, honestly, I had just been more transactional. But for me to trust anyone at all, we had to go through some real shit together, some peril, war stories. I think it's why I became so close to so many people from William Morris. We had exactly zero in common, but I had seen them under the toughest of circumstances, and it was clear, if nothing else, we shared our humanity. I wasn't so sure about the humanity of the rest of Hollywood, and I wasn't sure how to find it either. It wasn't like I was going to recreate the hell of the William Morris mailroom on my off hours. But how does one, like a scientist in his lab simulating the environmental conditions that first gave rise to life on Earth, engineer the circumstances that might spark a professional acquaintance into a true and genuine friendship? Certainly, it was not going to happen at any of the development mixers at places like Lola's I sometimes attended to meet new peeps. Groups of low-level execs working for middling producers, trading info about obscure agents and their specs from talentless writers. No thanks. Did I care when Shane Salerno's next screenplay was coming to market? Not really. I liked meeting people, but the whole exercise felt pointless. I certainly couldn't bond over a list of data that felt meaningless to me. I'd down a couple sour apple martinis and hit the road. But sometimes my idea of a deeply bonding experience just happened through fate. One time when my car was in the shop, I met an executive from Dimension for a drink at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. After an hour or so of idle chit-chat, where we'd exhausted the repertoire of origin stories and development drivel, I asked the exec if he wouldn't mind giving me a ride home. My roommate Heather and I had recently moved from the apartment in Hancock Park to a small post-and-beam bungalow up in Franklin Canyon, just above Beverly Hills. It was a 5-minute drive from the hotel. No matter how weird he found the request, and mind you, this was before the age of Uber, the executive obliged and we climbed in his car to head home. But on our way up the hill, as we were driving into the leafy climbs of the canyon, a deer came loping down the middle of the road. We were both kind of giddy at the sight, a taste of the wild in our urban jungle. But right as the animal was about to pass us, it suddenly veered toward our headlights and slammed into my colleague's front panel with a sickening crack. We screeched to a halt and leapt from the car. The injured deer lay stunned on the asphalt, its chest heaving. We stood in shock as it then slowly rose to its feet, pulling its injured limb close to its haunch, and hurtled itself over the guardrail and into the orange grove below, and disappeared. The exec and I stood there, mouths agape, as the glow of his headlights bathed the darkened hillside from the crumpled front end of his damaged car. We drove home in silence. I kind of thought this experience would bind us together forever, but I don't think we ever spoke to each other again. While I would have loved to drag every exec I met into a violent cataclysm with a giant charismatic fauna, misadventure for me generally began with getting pie-eyed drunk. The formula had been so successful for me in high school and college, it was hard to believe it wouldn't eventually bear fruit in L.A. and lead to lifelong Hollywood connects. Once the town had seen me pole dancing late night, what more would they need? I'd be invited into the inner circle where I'd drop my mask of canine amiability and forge strategic creative alliances with the other sharks. Of course, by the time I reached Los Angeles, my drinking career had already passed deep into the realm of dysfunction. A night might go right, and we'd end up frolicking joyfully at the Conga Room, but it was far more likely to go wrong, and I'd drink myself to the point of incoherence, or worse, which wasn't really fun for anyone. Also, going out to drink was a pretty arbitrary way to meet people. You might run into Carl Austin on the dance floor at St. Nick's, but you might see no one at all. Even at a good fun party where the host was dialed in, you couldn't tell who might show up. Thankfully, my roommate Heather had a solution. In a nod to the old aphorism, be the change you want to see in the world, she adopted the motto, throw the party you want to attend in the world. And she set about hosting our first function up at the place in Franklin Canyon. She playfully dubbed the event the Grill and Swill, hired a bartender and caterer, and started putting a guest list together. Heather had just returned from filming Hugh Wilson's hit comedy The First Wives Club, and subsequently joined Scott Rudin's company as his director of development. Rudin had prominent offices on the Paramount lot, and suddenly Heather had access to all the executives and producers and assistants based there. What's more, the position tapped her into one of the most vibrant networks in Hollywood. Rudin's former assistants and executives who held positions all over town. Networking was not just a way of life for them, it was their religion. Heather was the latest convert and ready to take her faith to the next level. Throwing your own party is actually a pretty effective networking ploy. Not only do you get to control the guest list, but you get to tell people you admire that they mean enough to you that you want them to come to your house. You can also punch above your weight, inviting colleagues more high profile and more powerful than yourself into your orbit. They don't even have to come, though it's great if they do. But just getting the invite and seeing your name in print puts you in their thoughts. That always felt valuable to me. Crazily enough, back then you couldn't just send a mass email. You had to send a fax. The fax would include a cover sheet with the recipient's name on it, followed by the invite itself, which might simply be made up of large font details for the event, or maybe include some artwork to dress the thing up. To send the invite, you had to actually pick up the phone and call people to get their fax numbers. Though you did have a lot of fax numbers in your Rolodex because we used the fax machine all the time back then. For someone you barely knew, though, you might have to call their assistant and risk the humiliation that they might not be willing to give out their boss's fax. Fax numbers were almost as valuable as email addresses back then. But Heather was unstoppable when it came to wrangling high-power guests. She was fearless. She bought a fax machine that we kept in our living room, and we blasted out faxes for the first grill and swill at all hours of the night. I came home one day from work to find a recently sent fax sitting on the machine's outbox. I checked the cover sheet. It was addressed to Barry Diller. "What the hell?" Heather laughed. "You never know. He might come." Spoiler alert, he didn't. But a lot of people did, and the place was packed. Our house was a great party house. It was a 3-bedroom with an open floor plan, a fireplace, and walls of glass looking out over a small yard. The house bifurcated the yard into 2 areas, a more intimate courtyard where we decided to house the bar, and the wider terrace where we'd serve food. Crowds spilled onto the lawn from the living room, and there were lots of interesting producers, executives, writers, and directors in attendance. It was, as Marie's grandmother used to say, a roaring success. Still, one of the bigger challenges for me when it came to social interactions was, and still is, the fact that I am effectively face blind. I cannot recognize people. It is especially bad in a crowd or a situation like a party where there is no context to support my meager powers of recognition. I'm good with voices, and I use haircuts and fashion sense to help me navigate the world, but if you show up in a strange suit or with a new do, I'm hopeless. Crowds of people where I should be able to remember everyone's name really stress me out. The grill and swill was particularly intense as I was at least nominally one of the hosts. People were coming up to me all night to say hello, and I couldn't tell who anyone was. It didn't help that Hollywood is relentlessly conformist. Why are all the movies alike? Hollywood doesn't have an original thought in its brain, and that lack of originality extends to personal style. Every agent and exec back then donned a black power suit. The D-girls all in black mini dresses, with Jennifer Aniston cuts atop every crown. I was lost in a sea of meaningless signifiers. At one point, Heather sent me over to a group of male execs to say hi to a new Lionsgate CE. But when I hollered his name, the whole group turned around to look at me. And they were, to a man, all wearing mid-thigh leather dusters and Caesar haircuts. Suddenly, I was in the Matrix with its multiple iterations of Hugo Weaving. Only here, they were all fashion victims. I fled in terror. The stress and excitement of it all became too much, and pretty soon I was so drunk I couldn't make meaningful connections anyway. Eventually I just started cleaning up so I'd have something to do, flitting around the party, picking up bottles and cans and dropping them in the trash. But when I stepped out into the little courtyard where we kept the bar, I stumbled on a piece of Heather's wrought iron furniture, camouflaged by the dark. I not only managed to fall to the ground, but I somehow pulled the piece over too, and it landed on top of me, pinning me to the terrace. I was pretty drunk. I cried out for help, not really expecting it to arrive. But by some miracle, the bartender materialized in the living room door. Salvation. He poked his head out, took the lay of the land, and then promptly closed the door and locked it from the inside. I whimpered in the dark until I started to laugh. It was a fitting end to my crass attempt to Gatsby my way to the top. On some level, I knew if I wanted more profound Hollywood friendships, I'd have to find a path that was not paved with booze. As effective as alcohol could be as a social lubricant, my experience had shown me that drunken bonding tended to be fleeting. Once the haze of alcohol had cleared, people put less store in the ties they formed under the influence. Drunken shenanigans are also often tinged with shame. No one wants to spend more time with the guy who coerced them into stripping off their shirt in front of their peers. If I wanted to make lasting relationships in Hollywood, I knew I needed to find activities that involved a level of risk and vulnerability more wholesome than alcohol poisoning. Sports seemed the likely course, but I didn't know how to play basketball. Golf took up too much time. Paintball seemed absurd. I had some tennis buddies, but it was hard to put together a group that played at the same level, week after week. So when my new friend, Dee Dee Gardner, a recently minted vice president at Paramount, invited me and my girlfriend to join a group of Hollywood execs on a ski trip to Vail, I leapt at the chance. What could be more bonding than the perils of the slope and the intimate recovery of après-ski? We were in. To be clear, I'm not a great skier. I didn't grow up in a ski family. When I was a kid, my grandparents lived in Florida, so we'd spend most vacations visiting them. Still, I managed in elementary school to glom on to a few ski trips with other families, and that got me started. When I was 8, Duke Barnett's dad, the famously affable Bear Barnett, took us up to Wyndham for a week. He rented a condo right on the mountain, but I still remember the Herculean effort required to put on our skis every morning and walk the 50 feet to the slope. Even sweet Bear lost his cool completely, just about every day. Taking young kids skiing is the worst. I had told him I knew how to ski because I had skied once when I was 5, and I figured I still had game. The first morning I stepped on the slope, I pointed my skis straight down the mountain and performed such an acrobatic display, riding most of the runs sitting on the back of my skis as I flew through one set of caution sticks after another, that Bear was still talking about it years later. To my dismay, he put me directly into ski school, and thereby gave me the fundamentals I would carry with me for the rest of my life. In college, I traveled with a gang of friends between terms at the University of East Anglia during a semester abroad. We started our Eurail passes in Corfu and made our way north through Italy to Vienna. On impulse, we stopped for 2 nights in Innsbruck, rented skis, put wool socks over our hands, and spent a day of glorious spring skiing in our blue jeans in the Alps. One of those guys later invited me to Aspen over Christmas, and I learned what it was like to try to keep up with 6 psycho ski goons determined to fling themselves off the deepest, steepest terrain on all of Ajax. I loved it. Once I moved to Los Angeles, I only managed a single trip. My cousins, the Gearys, took me to Aspen to ski one weekend. I still didn't have proper gear at that point, but my uncle brought me into his room at Little Nell, showed me his veritable trousseau of ski outfits, and gave me pick of the litter. I chose a 2-piece orange number, matching pants and jacket, that was surprisingly light and warm. It was also pretty hysterical. Let's just say I was easy to spot on the slopes. A few years later, when Uncle Jack suddenly died from pancreatic cancer, my cousin sent me his ski suit as a token of his affection and, in my mind, a totemic reminder of how not to take yourself too seriously and how to enjoy a life well lived. Naturally, when it came time to pack for Dee Dee's ski trip, I tossed Jack's orange ski suit into my bag and headed off to Colorado. My girlfriend, Marie, who skied even less, had to reach out to a friend to borrow a ski suit for herself. No surprise here, Marie did win an Emmy for costume design for the series Transparent. She managed to score a purple onesie, fresh out of someone's high 80s closet. Boy, did we make a pair. We arrived in Vail, where Dee Dee's parents owned a pristine, modern mountain house overlooking the slopes. It was gorgeous. Floor-to-ceiling plate glass windows, Native American artwork, sleek modern appliances. The other guests were, in my mind, heavy hitters. At least they were part of a clique of cool kids in Hollywood that I believed would aid my success if I could just prove I belonged. There was Dee Dee, of course, who would go on to run Brad Pitt's company and win Best Picture Oscars for Moonlight and 12 Years a Slave. She also brought her boyfriend and soon-to-be husband, Elf producer John Berg. There was Michael Costigan, a VP at Columbia Pictures, who currently runs Jason Bateman's company and was the great champion of Oscar winner Brokeback Mountain. Doug McLaren, a partner at ICM, was there as well, as was Elisa Koplowitz, a VP at MTV, who is now a prolific producer at Alloy. I don't believe Stokely Chaffin is still in the biz, but she was one of the guests and was at the time a vice president at New Line. The only person who was not an executive or agent was Dee Dee's old dear friend Hardy Ophuls, who was working as a teamster at the time while trying to break into Hollywood as a scribe. I wanted very badly to be friends with all of these people, to have lasting, meaningful relationships with them. I didn't do the best job. First of all, no one seemed to appreciate the genius of mine and Maria's ski outfits. Where we had played the aesthetic for laughs, everyone else had gone for cool, sleek, snowboarding outfits, gear in icy muted tones. We were the sumo wrestlers at Halloween, forced to play opposite everyone else's sexy nurse. It didn't help matters that on the ski slopes, Marie could not really keep up. As the coterie of producers and execs went bombing down the mountain, Marie made pizzas and leisurely S-turns along the trail. I tried to bridge the gap, keeping the clique of skiers in sight as I waited for my girlfriend to catch up, but it was pretty hopeless. I chided and glowered. How could we bond on the chairlift if we weren't even there at the end of the run? The effect, to no one's surprise, was to piss Mary off. We then waddled into lunch to find the table already packed and ourselves relegated to a table alone. Nothing was really going down as planned. What made matters worse was that when it came to room selection, the whole party had drawn straws, and Marie and I had drawn the shortest of all, and ended up relegated to the pull-out sofa in the TV room downstairs. It was perfectly comfortable, but it did mean we didn't enjoy much privacy. No break from the group dynamics where we could argue with each other at the top of our lungs. We needed that release. We did do some group bonding, of course. There were big boozy dinners at Dee Dee's dining room table, where everyone cooked and we all got to know a bit more about our gang. I don't remember much about those nights. I do remember one exec asking Marie what she was reading, and Marie excitedly telling them it was a book that she thought would actually make a great movie. It was a comedic romance sent to her by her British cousins in London, because it had been ripping up the bestseller list on the other side of the pond. Marie told them its title, Bridget Jones's Diary. Diaries, the exec explained, tend to be too interior to make good movies. Hollywood can be so dumb. In my memory, Marie became so annoyed by the whole dynamic that on the last day she decided not to ski. This seems unlikely, but I know I spent the days skiing with the only person in the group who was not some Hollywood player, Hardy Ophuls. If it was Hollywood connection I was after, things were not going my way. But Hardy was an elegant skier and an elegant guy, and we bombed around the mountain all morning, working off our hangovers and having a glorious time. Around noon I had exercised enough to regain my appetite, and we stopped for lunch at a mid-slope hot dog stand that sat at the base of lift 11. Every time you ordered a Schnauzer dog, some sort of German brat, you could hear the guys in the kitchen cackling gleefully, Schnauzer dog, now, Schnell, Schnell! I ordered one for myself and instantly started wolfing it down. I was midway through my third bite of Schnauzer dog when I realized I hadn't adequately chewed the first two, and there was now a great knob of sausage meat wedged in my throat. I was choking. I tried to stay calm. I choked a lot back then. I didn't know it at the time, but I was suffering from some kind of autoimmune disorder that was triggered by stress and was made more acute when I was drunk, hungover, or half-starved. In other words, it happened all the time. I tried my usual fix and picked up my crabapple juice and tried to wash the chunk down with a couple big chugs. It didn't work. Cranberry juice just glug-glugged out of my mouth, down my chin, and all over my orange suit. I panicked as I suddenly realized that I was going to die. I turned to Hardy, terrified, and made the universal sign for choking. He leapt to his feet, pulling me up with him, and instantly started to give me the Heimlich maneuver. Unfortunately, it didn't work. I am taller than Hardy, and I don't think he could pull his fist into my belly at the correct angle, no matter how hard he tried. Time really does slow down when you're dying. I couldn't breathe, but I could hear those boys in the kitchen now calling the paramedics. Schnell, Schnell, I thought. But before the paramedics arrived, I felt a new, larger set of arms wrap themselves around my torso. A giant mountain of a man pulled my feet right off the ground as he jammed his fist into my sternum. I didn't know who he was, but I was in full surrender. I wanted to live, and I was thrilled someone had joined the cause. Unfortunately, the results were nil. I still couldn't breathe at all, but he was not deterred. And again he pummeled my belly, heaving me into his arms and dropping me back to my feet. And this time, while not the relieving gush of air I saw shooting into my lungs, I could at least feel a thin whistle, somehow making it past the blockade. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel pretty sure I wasn't going to die. I wrestled my way out of the strange man's arms. I felt like he was squeezing the air out of me as well, and I needed space. I hunched around the silent picnic area, desperately trying to regain my breath. By the time the paramedics arrived, a veritable phalanx of ski-mobiles and toboggans, I was breathing like an 8-year-old emphysema victim, but I was breathing. The paramedics wanted to give me another round of Heimlichs, but I demurred. I couldn't bear the thought of getting squeezed again. They did convince me to lie face down on a picnic table while they pounded my back. Maybe it helped. Eventually I stuck a finger down my throat and managed to cack the offending piece of sausage into the snow, and at last feel some relief. I took in my surroundings to see a snowy picnic area now stained with great slashes of red, a cranberry juice murder scene where no one had died. The paramedics wanted me to go to the hospital for further evaluation, but I told them I planned to stay on the mountain and ski out the rest of my day. They were not pleased. They made me fill out a ream of legal paperwork relieving them of any liability. As the lead paramedic explained each page I signed, the other paramedics kicked snow over the red arcs of cranberry juice, stopping again and again at the offending chunk of sausage, leaving it exposed as if it might still serve some vital role in the investigation ahead. As I was about to sign the last sheet of paper and ski off, the lead paramedic grabbed the ballpoint pen from my hand. You know your vocal cords could still swell up and choke you a second time. If that happens, we'd have to cut a hole in your throat and jam this in the opening. He waved the pen in my face. This seemed pretty unlikely. I choked all the time and never came anywhere close to an emergency tracheotomy. But these were extenuating circumstances, and suddenly caution felt like the better half of valor. I relented and agreed to go to the hospital to be safe. There was a silver lining, though. The only way they could legally get me off the mountain was to ride me down in a first aid toboggan. Still cresting a wave of endorphins from my near-death experience, few sights have felt more glorious than the snow-covered treetops zipping by above me as I lay comfortably nestled in the bottom of that sleigh. By the time I got to the hospital and drank a couple glasses of water under the watchful eye of a nurse, it was time to head back to L.A. We had 2 SUVs carrying the crew around Vail, so one came straight to the hospital and picked me up as the other went ahead to Denver. I was able to tell Marie and everyone in my car the tale of my misadventure, but I didn't see the others until I was on the plane. As we hit cruising altitude on the flight home, one person after another from the other car stopped by my row to see how I was doing. I kept telling everyone I was fine. The hospital had been no big deal. I was touched but also embarrassed by the attention. What a way to finally make an impression on my movie biz friends. After I ordered a cocktail, I started chatting with the guy in the window seat beside me, and he asked me what had happened. I choked on a hot dog, I told him, and he nodded sympathetically, motioning to his own foot wrapped in a plastic brace. We then shared a couple drinks on the 2-hour flight back to LA and became fast friends. It's funny, he said as our wheels touched down on the tarmac at LAX. When you told me you'd choked on a hot dog, I assumed you meant you'd wiped down on a double black diamond, trying a back scratcher off a mogul run. But now that I know you a little, I guess you just choked on a hot dog. I shrugged. What could I say? He had me pegged. It was a war story of sorts. I survived the peril, but it didn't bond me any deeper to anyone in Hollywood on that trip. I wasn't invited back to Vail the next year, and I get it. Dee Dee's star was on the rise. She'd moved to the next level where there were bigger fish to fry, and only so many beds in the ski house. Maybe she could see I wasn't going anywhere fast. Perhaps I'd already peaked. Or maybe that failure to break through the superficial niceties, to connect on some deeper level, was reason enough. We all just didn't click. It was no more complicated than that. Of course, it could also have just been me. I'm the one who came with the agenda, and hard as I tried to hide it, maybe everyone could smell it, a subtle pheromone of desperation. I did, however, remain close to one guy, Hardy Ophuls, the guy who saved my life. That'll bond you for sure. Our kids grew up together and we still see each other about once a week. But what if I'd been eating that hot dog with someone else from that trip? Would we too be tied for eternity by that fateful lunch? Somehow I doubt it. I killed a deer with a Hollywood exec and we never spoke again. I can't even remember his name. So perhaps the bonds of friendship stem from something more mysterious than shared experience alone. Perhaps they can't be engineered. Maybe there's an alchemy at play as divine as the origins of life itself.